The terror plot in the United States is growing. A fourth man from New York City has been arrested, suspected of supporting ISIS, accused of plotting to assassinate President Obama, murder police and military personnel. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Costello in New York, and it's not just men who are doing the plotting. The FBI also says there is a pipeline to recruit young American Muslim women. Let's bring ABC's crime and terror analyst Brad Garrett. Brad, let's start with this latest arrest. What do we know about this suspect and his ties to those three Brooklyn men who were indicted last month?
This was, I think, a natural progression, Carolyn, where you have the three arrested, and many times in these cases where you have recruitment, financing, and ultimately attempting to go to Syria, you pull in other players. And so I think this fourth guy was pulled in after they identified the first three. They were arrested because a lot of this is driven by what the federal government calls materials to support terrorism, which basically means funding terrorism. And I believe this fourth guy got caught. He was taking money to the airport to give to another guy that was ultimately going to Syria.
Right, and we're hearing that he raised about $1,600 to travel to Syria, Turkey, to travel overseas. The people who gave him that money, could those people be arrested here as well?
Potentially. Anybody who provides money that they know it's to fund terrorism or go to support a terrorist group could be subject to being charged. So yes, that's entirely possible.
And one of the suspects in this connection of four men, we know he operated mall kiosks in 4 different states. Did that have anything to do with how he was able to bring people in to the plot?
Well, of course. I mean, if you just walk around New York and see who tends to go to kiosks, it's obviously a mixture of people, but they're natural gathering spots for many times like-minded people, or they are attracted to it because of the guy or person running the kiosk. The other is there's a lot of cash that changes hands at kiosks that, obviously are never recorded. So it sort of makes it readily available to collect cash under the radar that they can then ultimately funnel to an extremist group.
We know ISIS is also targeting women. We had 2 women arrested in New York City last week. The FBI saying that one of those women, who's seen in a video we have here, as well as one of her best friends, wanted to attack the United States. They were part, allegedly, of a terror sisterhood of sorts. What do we know about these two and the process of recruiting women now?
Well, I think these pretty much fit the profile of what you see of women either actually joining ISIS or attempting to join. And it goes through the following process. Many times contacted via online, and many times it's women recruiting women because they tend to listen to women more who maybe are actually in Syria or are pretending to be in Syria, and they paint the following picture. They're going to build up and go through a number of questions with a potential candidate of, do you feel alienated in your country, whether it be the U.S., England, etc.? Do you feel like you don't really are allowed to practice your religion? They'll talk at length about how Muslims have been abused by Western authorities over the years. So the combination of feeling alienated, but then feeling empowered when you're told, look, come and join us. We're going to create basically this fantasy. In effect, they don't use that word, obviously, a utopia, a new state. You can be part of that new state. You can help us. You'll have a purpose. We're going to pay attention to you. We're going to pay your way here. And then, of course, when you get there, it's an entirely different reality. But the lure of all of the above and sort of the naive view of the kids that are having these conversations and are watching videos is enough of an attraction, at least for a percentage of them, to pull them towards Syria.
Now, you mentioned fantasy. I remember reading somewhere that women were being recruited to ISIS through some animated films. What is the difference between the way men are being recruited and women? How is the appeal different, or are they using similar tactics?
Well, they're clearly using similar tactics, but the men approach is more action-driven. In other words, they, in effect, in my view, sort of create this pretend video game where we're going to give you weapons. This is going to be exciting. You're going to be able to go into combat and kill people that are against the Islamic State, which is basically the whole world, except people who believe in the Islamic State's religious beliefs. And so that's the fantasy, I think, for a guy. The other things, Carolyn, I described to you about alienation and the awful things the West is doing, and that you can be part of creating this wonderful utopia, Islamic State, if you will. That's very similar. It's just a little bit different bent. The women, are more, I guess, portrayed. Yes, you're going to be a big help, but you're going to be more in a support role. You're going to immediately marry somebody, hopefully start having kids, and for some reason that is a draw. for some of these women. In fact, one of the recent female recruits apparently was having this romantic, if you will, relationship online with supposedly an ISIS fighter, and that she was going to go join him.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. People who are sort of confused on their identity, don't know quite where they fit in the United States. This gives them that huge sense of purpose and something greater than themselves to be a part of. We know the men who were indicted last month have all pled not guilty. With all the evidence against them, considering the case, is this unusual?
No, it's actually quite normal. In federal court, when you're arrested, you're presented. The judge reads the charge to you, understands that you are who you are, that you have a lawyer, all the legal sort of ramifications that go on. But nobody is allowed to plead guilty at that point. It's on the record they plead not guilty, because if you want to plead at some point, that is an agreement between you, your attorney, and in this case, the U.S. attorney. And if an agreement's reached that you're willing to plead guilty to the following charges for the following potential sentence, then that is presented to the judge. But we're talking several hearings from now.
What are the potential sentences here for these people? Because, while they're accused of plotting some pretty horrific things, and terrorism is such an extreme federal offense, they've not actually harmed anyone to this point. But could they be spending the rest of their lives in prison?
Well, they could spend a big chunk. Obviously, these don't carry a life sentence. I think probably the maximum would be 30 years. I've not seen anybody get that from material support. A female was recently sentenced, and I think a juvenile, or barely a juvenile. I think the judge gave her 4 years, trying to send the signal out, look, if you're going to try to join these extremist groups, you're going to get punished for it. So it depends a lot, Carolyn, on how extensive these four were involved. Are there other players? How much money have they sent? What is their relationship with ISIS? All of those things will play into a potential sentence. So more activity, more involvement. I suspect the guy that's running the kiosk may potentially be in the most trouble as far as potential time.
And when you do have an aspiring terrorist who gets out in 4 or 10 years, does the federal government then have to follow them for the rest of their life to track their behavior and make sure they don't get right back into it?
We have two things going on. When you get out of prison, there's a thing called supervised release. It's just another term for parole, basically. That continues until the end of your statutory sentence, whatever that might be. But the intelligence community and law enforcement are not tied to that, obviously. They're going to continue to monitor you as far as associations, who you're talking to, a number of things that potentially will give them an idea, are you stepping back into your old role or not? The biggest problem, Carolyn, here is numbers. The sheer numbers of people that are now appearing to either want to join ISIS or Al-Qaeda, whatever it might be. I mean, these things are manpower intense for the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, and my big concern is these numbers are going to keep growing, and we're going to have trouble keeping up.
Right, because it costs a lot of money to trail people and for all that surveillance to
Exactly.
continue. We've heard about that in the news. We're seeing, you said the sheer numbers here, we're seeing one at least a week, U.S. citizens being arrested, accused of supporting ISIS, wanting to join. Is this because the FBI is stepping up its efforts, or is it truly because of these recruitment efforts by ISIS that these numbers are really growing? We're just seeing more people who want to join ISIS and carry out terror attacks.
I think it's twofold, Carolyn. I think the recruitment aspect of this has gotten much better. So that's going to increase your percentage of people who want to join. And then you have the FBI, this is really their highest priority now, counterterrorism, where they're actively involved trying to identify people, identify groups, obviously stop potential attacks. And every one of these cases you and I have been talking about this morning are ones that the FBI basically knew somewhat in advance, and they sort of got in the middle of them, I suspect, in an undercover capacity, and then figured out the details at that point. The biggest fear, obviously, are the folks that are a little more sophisticated, stay under the radar, they don't talk to anybody. I mean, even as unsophisticated as their Tsarnaev brothers were, the Boston Marathon bombers, they were on someone's radar, but they were flying under it. Mm-hmm. And that's why they were successful. And that's the big concern of folks like them down the road.
And the fourth suspect related to the Brooklyn men will be in court tomorrow. What do we expect to see with him tomorrow?
I think what you're going to have is basically a hearing where the judge tells him, this is what you've been charged with. These are the maximum potential sentences. You're represented by counsel. They'll enter a plea of not guilty, and then he'll start the process at that point as to where, in effect, does he want to go? Does he want a trial at some point? Does he not? There's a lot of negotiation in trying to figure out a plea agreement, particularly in these terrorism cases. That's why it usually takes several months to sort of iron that out.
Brad, really quickly, a lot of these cases we see undercover officers getting involved, as you said, sort of intercepting. They find the women or the men, they get involved. How much of their defense can be based on sort of, I don't know, a claim of entrapment, or the undercover officer leading the suspected terrorist down a certain path?
That typically has not been successful, Carolyn, particularly in terrorism cases, and here's the reason why, is that the FBI and other agencies will force you, in effect force you, to walk through the steps. In other words, you have to be motivated to do whatever you're going to do. You're going to say it on tape. And not so much these 4 cases you and I are talking about, but think about the cases over the years where people wanted to blow up, like a Christmas celebration in Oregon or the state of Washington a couple of years ago. I mean, they literally let him go right up and gave him a dummy detonator thinking he was going to blow up a bunch of people, and then they arrested him. So it can't be that you just say it. You have to do it. In the case of material support, see where they arrest them? They arrest them at the airport many times, where they are there, they're about to get on a plane, typically to Istanbul, and then to go into Syria. So that's a lot of steps. So the idea that you got entrapped when you're doing all the things, that's a real uphill battle for defense attorneys. And my guess is, not knowing the facts of these 4, that they'll have a lot of trouble trying to use that as a defense.
Right, because we know the women bought the propane tanks, or they're accused of buying the propane tanks, having the fertilizer. Right. Brad, thank you so much. This is always a fascinating subject. Appreciate your insight very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And you can keep up with this story in real time by downloading the ABC News app, storing this story for exclusive updates on the go. I'm Carolyn Costello in New York.